Welcome to another episode of Holocaust Remembrance Around the World, sponsored by the Emil A. and Jenny Fish Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies at Yeshiva University. In this monthly series, we find people all over the world who are shaping and reshaping Holocaust memory and education. My name is Kara Torres Kilgannon, and I am an MA student in the program and will be the moderator for this month. Today, we will travel to England to meet with Trevor Avery from the Lake District Holocaust Project. Hello, Mr. Avery.
Hello, nice to see you all.
So can you begin by telling us what is the Lake District Holocaust Project and how you got involved?
Oh, it's I've been working on it now for 17 years. We began in 2005. It was a chance comment made by somebody who lived locally in Windermere. Windermere, for those who don't know, it's in the north of England. It's lakes, it's mountains. It's famous for the Romantic poets, Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats. But I put on an exhibition in 2005 in the small market town of Kendal, tiny market town. And I'd heard during the war, the Second World War, it had nearby on the shores of Lake Windermere was an aircraft factory built, aircraft. It was here because it was secret, it was hard to find, it was, all that sort of thing that goes with wartime activities. But they built a housing scheme to house the workers who came up to work there. So I put on a small exhibition, and I was commissioned to do an exhibition about the factory and the scheme. And that was when one of the workers came in, the ex-workers, and he simply said, of course, this is where the children from Auschwitz came. And of course, I didn't know. And I thought, this needs looking into. I actually went away to read about it. And I finally came across Sir Martin Gilbert's book, Triumph Over Adversity. And I thought, this is excellent. But then I checked out the chapter where he talks about Windermere. He talks about Carlisle, and it was. I knew from living here, I had first-hand knowledge of the area and what he talked about, and I could see there was so much more to it than he covered in the book. So I then contacted one of the survivors, Sir Ben Helfgott, and I said, Sir Ben, you don't know me. I'm Trevor from the north of England, near Windermere. I'd like to tell your story and the story of all the children that came with you. And his opening words were, oh, Windermere. Oh, wonderful. Come and meet. I'll arrange for you to meet myself and some survivors. And that was the beginning of the story. And I really stress with people, don't assume or presume that something's been done. I did meet people here eventually, and they said, and they were sort of from a historical background, oh, we've done it already. We've interviewed them, we've done it. I know we're going to come back to it later, but what they'd covered were the kinder transport children here that we had in the Lake District at the time. And it's a common misconception among the general public, shall we say, certainly in England, the UK. It's changing now, but the kinder transport, that it's a term that's used for all Holocaust survivors that came here, but these children that came in August 1945 were very different from the kinder transport. It's a very different scheme, their experiences. There were the two groups were both tragedies in their own way. But the kinder transport children's, that scheme was fundamentally different from the survivors that we welcomed into Windermere. So I began to look, and I thought, they say they've done it. Well, let's have a look at what they have. And I had a little bit of knowledge from previous work because I'd interviewed Holocaust survivors before when I worked in Scotland, and I'd met kinder transport and I met refugees. And I could see that the interviews that they'd done there were small children here, and these weren't the children that came in 1945. So instead of stressing people, instead of turning away and said, oh, we've already done it, you don't need to, I thought, okay, then I won't bother. I kind of looked and I thought, no, this isn't right. This is something different. And that's when I began, and I met 3 of the survivors, Maya, Jack, and Sam, in Manchester, and they bounded into this place. Now, I expected a very, very dark meeting of a survivor, and I was with a couple of colleagues, and 3 very, very sprightly gentlemen bounded in. There was almost as if they were danced in, and it sounds odd, but we had a great time. I thought the meeting was 2 hours, it was 5 hours. But for the final half an hour, I did say to her, I'd like to tell your stories. And all of them talked about Windermere. So it wasn't difficult to get them to talk about it. And then the other aspect, I began to find local people who remembered them. So in a sense, I didn't discover the story. The story lay there waiting to be found. There were 2 groups of disparate people. And I just, with the team, encouraged them to talk about it from their perspective, the other from their perspective. And that really is where the project came from. And here we are. I thought it would be a 2-year project, 17 years later. There's still much, much more to do. Yeah. So I hope that helps.
Yes, no, so that goes nicely into my next question, which you touched upon. The Windermere program is not as well known as the Kindertransport. And for our listeners who don't know about the Kindertransport, that's when nearly 10,000 mostly Jewish children from Nazi-occupied territories were moved to Britain between 1938 and 1939. And at the time, politicians argued it was a humanitarian duty to care for these refugee children. And former Prime Minister Lord Baldwin appealed to the people to support refugees who were seeking sanctuary from what he called an explosion of man's inhumanity demand. So why do you think England stepped up to help the children before and after the war when many other countries stepped away?
I think it's fair to say that England and Britain's relationship and what it did concerning the Holocaust is mixed in many levels. In many ways, its responses were mixed, but we have to be grateful for small mercies in the sense that the receipt of those 10,000 children was an enormous humanitarian gesture. They did have to leave their parents and families behind, but they did welcome them. And similarly, if you talk to certainly the survivors came in August 45, they'd been in the camps, they'd witnessed things, they'd lost families in a different way. They'd actually experienced the concentration camp system, including Auschwitz, etc. But they are very, very intensely grateful to Britain for receiving them. Finally, there was a final total of 732 Holocaust survivor children that came under the scheme. The Windermere group of 300 were the first to arrive. The others arrived over 2 years. They went to different places. They didn't have the numbers or the setting or the location like Windermere. You know, they went to smaller hostels in different parts of the country. And I've pondered for a while. I mean, I often say to people when people, you know, they saw the Windermere Children drama and they saw the documentary, and they would say, I've been coming to the Lake District for 40 years. I didn't know this story. Why not? And I think I'll be slightly contentious when the BBC and Pathé News, people wanted to cover, they were called the Belsen children because Belsen was the film that was the camp that the British Army had liberated and filmed. That had already been shown in cinemas here. You know, we know that some of the Kindertransport girls that were in the hostel here in Windermere, there were 25 girls there. One of them, they had seen footage of the liberation of Belsen camp in the local cinema at the Royalty here. So we know that local people had seen concentration camps. That certainly played a factor in their welcoming of the youngsters when they came. They knew what they'd lived through, or they had an indication of that. But I think they wanted to cover them landing at the airport. Now, Leonard Montefiore of the Central British Fund, they had a discussion about it, and they decided to prevent TV and documentary people covering the arrival because they thought these children needed to be kept away from the spotlight, need to recover in peace. There was a concern that they didn't want the notion of celebrity to go to their heads. they were quite hard to handle, some of them. So they initially have this sort of this news blackout on their arrival. But it's interesting when you talk to one or two of the survivors, when you dig beneath there is the story of, and it's a very, very powerful narrative, and it's true to the extent that we came here, Windermere was wonderful. It was, we survived against all the odds. It was a great place, the people were great. Beneath that, if you dig a little bit deeper, one or two of the survivors have said to us, people didn't know how to relate to us. They really didn't know. One of them was very, very harsh, and he said, we came surrounded by death. They knew where we'd been, they were going. And he said it was an understandable human reaction as to, apart from the carers at the front line who provided the therapy and the care. I mean, there wasn't one art therapist here. There were three. We know there were three, and a rabbi on hand. There were about 30, 40 volunteers to help. One for each 10 children. So they knew. And in fact, one of the carer team had a nervous breakdown listening to the stories. Another one said, I couldn't listen to them anymore. So I think what happened, and we have one famous incident where one of the carers is listening to some of our young survivors in a room at Calgarth at Windermere, and she actually went down and asked them to move. She said, I can't listen to it. I need to defend myself. The stories, the focus when they arrived, which sounds strange to our ears now, was mainly about the death marches and the hunger. Very few conversations about the camps. I think that came later. So their immediate, most recent response had been those. And the carers, and you imagine if you have a therapist, one of the nominal therapists in charge, and even they come to you and say, do you mind taking that conversation elsewhere? I need to rest. So I think for the children themselves, you'll hear them say, we got on well with each other because we all knew the story. We didn't need to share it with others. In fact, we know they did share it. So I think whereas the kinder transport, it's interesting that the UK, there's another kinder transport memorial opened on the coast. We're at Liverpool Street, we have fairly significant memorials to the kinder transport children scheme. There are plans for a national memorial to commemorate the Holocaust here. That's hit sort of planning issues and things. But at the moment, it was a small glade in Hyde Park. There are a lot of work's been on Holocaust commemoration and memorialization, but it's a very, very, and I think we're coming to a stage now where much more is known about the Holocaust. The survivors themselves have talked more about it. But I think it was a more recent, a more difficult subject than kinder transport. In my own experience, you will find once upon a time you could talk about kinder transport, people would chat about that. When you begin to talk about the Holocaust and survivors, people can close in on themselves. It's really hard for some people to deal with it. It's such a dark aspect. It's very troubling for people. So I think, I've offered a couple of sort of on-site reasons to why, but also I think it's taken time and an awful lot of skill from people in the Holocaust education profession, a lot of research for the stories of the survivors and the courage of the survivors to tell their stories, which for many of them came later in life. And I think it's beginning to emerge now. And I think we're part of that sort of wave of commemorating the survivors and what they lived through publicly. I think it's been very difficult for the society, for the culture, and for the survivors themselves. And I think it's a question of timing. I did ask one of the survivors in 2010, I said, I wish I'd started this project before I did in 2005, when more of you were still alive, etc. And he said, but we wouldn't have talked about it then. I think there was a silence, there was a sensitivity about it. They had to process things, they had to have children and grandchildren. we talked earlier that the trauma is, I think, a significant element of this. The trauma took time, and the care and the therapy. For many of them, I don't think they ever could talk. Well, I know they couldn't talk about it. So I think it's complicated, but I think the time, we got the timing right. We came along at the right time, you know, and I've learned as I've gone along that as one of the boys said, you know, people didn't want to hear us. We came surrounded by death. They didn't know how to communicate with us. People found it difficult. So I hope this helps people. These are just my thoughts, in a sense, and my experiences from working here.
Mm-hmm. And this next question, could you kind of set a scene for us? If you could go back in time, when and where would you go, and what event would you like to visit, and why?
Without doubt, we had a description from one of the carers from a journal of the moments that the children, they flew over on August 14th. They'd arrived at Carlisle Airport. They were then brought on buses, 300 of them, to this remote village settlement in the Lake District. Many of them arrived at the dead of night or in darkness. They didn't know where they'd arrived. And then Marie Paneth described in her book how next day, the people in the village where they were staying, they were out in the lanes as usual. I think she described it, chatting and talking. Then at noon, 12 noon, the doors opened of the hostels where the 300 youngsters were, and they just burst out onto the scene. They burst into the Lake District. And she said, we all had our breath and thought, how is this going to work? And immediately conversations began between local children, local people living at Calgarth, and the Jewish children, the survivors, even though they didn't know the same language. She said they chatted, there were gifts exchanged, with excitement in the air, and even to the extent where one of the Jewish child survivors said to Marie at that very moment almost, who are these people being so friendly to us? And she said, well, you're right, these aren't Jewish people being friendly to you, these are ordinary British people being friendly to you. And I wish I could have been there to hear the child say, these are good people, this must be a good country. I think that set, the mind boggles as to what could have happened if it hadn't gone, if it had been anything less than that kind of welcome. They had been prepared for 2 weeks, the local community, there had been meetings saying, look, we're going to receive these children. They're from the concentration camps. They didn't say Holocaust, and we don't know how they're going to be ourselves. So please bear with us. Thank you for having us living amongst you. These academics and psychiatrists and volunteers from London mainly, but also bear with us because these children could be difficult. And she said it was just a huge sense of relief when this energy exploded. And we have to acknowledge and see that according to the survivors themselves, for the first 3 or 4 weeks here, it was like a holiday for them. They didn't know where they'd come, but it was great. So for the first 3 weeks, there was a lot of fun, a lot of energy. You know, these are children who'd survived the camps. You know, there was a group of very small children up to the age of 6, you know, the youngest was under 3 years old. We had another group of sort of teenagers. For the older teenagers, 15, 16 years old, they've been in the camps for 3, 4 years. So to come here, I think one of them put it very well. We were liberated in Theresienstadt, but we didn't feel free until we came to Windermere. And I would love to have been there on that morning when they burst out into a sunny Lake District of hills and mountains. And as Ben said, we were effervescent. I think I would have wept openly if I'd seen them, if I'd been there at the time. But to witness that explosion of energy and freedom and survival, the tougher journey lay ahead of them when they had to come to terms with what happened. They found, but at that moment, they were just full of life. They just went out there, and you can hear it in their voice when you talk to them. Many of their children say that when the survivors left Windermere, they moved off to hostels in London and Manchester, around the world. And one of them said to me recently, where I lived, they all grouped together in London. He said, my father was one of the winners. He said, I grew up, we never visited Windermere, but we had this mythical place that they all talked about, Windermere. And it embedded itself in them. And it's, I'd never been, but I do remember all of them talking about Windermere. And it was the beginning of their new lives. They'd left behind, almost literally, the lives that had been so devastated. And some of them had tried, when the Theresienstadt, they tried to go home. It wasn't a great experience, so they went back to Theresienstadt. So they literally had no option open to them really than to, do you want to go to England? Yeah, even if they didn't really know what it was. Yeah, and boy, when they came, they really started their new lives here. I get excited about it.
Well, I was lucky when I lived in England to have the opportunity to visit the Lake District, and you can't help but be overcome by the relaxing feeling, the picturesque atmosphere. For those that haven't been able to see in person the Lake District in Calgarth, can you just describe it briefly so they can kind of paint a picture in their head?
Yeah, it's mountains, lakes. It was once upon a time called Little Switzerland. It was sort of an invention of William Wordsworth, the Daffodil poem, the famous one, and the Romantic poets, where it's over 200 years ago, instead of being frightened of this wilderness, actually it could be inspirational. So it's a place of romanticism in all sorts of ways, of this sublime. It hasn't changed an awful lot in the 80 years or so since the children were here. It's very, very, little quaint cottages, lakes. We get all kinds of weather, but at its best, it's described as being the sublime. And it sort of is. It's quite homely. It's very small, but it's very, very, very powerful. It's a very powerful part of English and British identity. It's the place where people come to rest, to recuperate. And the survivors that came were part of a tradition. We had soldiers from the Napoleonic War came here, survivors, to recover. We had soldiers after the First World War came here to recover. We had children here who were survivors of the Spanish Civil War came here in the 1930s. Then we had the Kinder Transport, then we had the survivors, and now we've just welcomed the first of the Ukrainian families to arrive here, offering. It's a place where people can come and recuperate. It could be battle damaged soldiers. There are hospitals here, children's hospitals, and it's a place of rest, recuperation. And I think what I remember Sam last year, one of the survivors said, we came here and we had given little rooms in little hostels, but we used to drag our blankets onto the fell side. You imagine heather and the fells, and it was lovely weather. And we used to sleep on blankets under the skies, under the stars. Another blessing, we don't have an awful lot of street lighting, so you still get the full constellation of the stars. So you can imagine, by choice, they slept outside under the stars. So that gives an indication of what we have here. Words can never express it, but it is ridiculously poetic in a sense that these child survivors came to the Lake District as the first part of their journey. And I think that's a key part as to why it became a focus for the Windermere Children drama.
So unfortunately, many of the children didn't have families and homes to go back to, so they stayed in England after the war. And you mentioned one of the most well-known of the Windermere children already, Sir Ben Helfgott. He was a survivor of Buchenwald and Theresienstadt, who went on to become a world-class athlete representing Great Britain in weightlifting in the Olympic Games of 1956 and 1960. Can you tell us about the lives of one or two other survivors that you've gotten to know well since starting the project?
Oh, yeah, there are many. The one I'm working on at the moment with his daughter, Michael is still with us, Michael Novis. He lives in the States, working with his daughter and family, working on his life. He was in the Warsaw Ghetto. He escaped in several camps, but what's really fascinating, he came here very, very unwell. Of the 300 that came to Windermere, 60 were very unwell, and that would be TB, typhus, osteomyelitis, polio, very encephalitis, all sorts of disease illnesses. Well, we know there were at least 6 sanatoriums, hospitals here. So the ones at Calgarth were the healthy ones. Michael arrived and he was placed straight into a sanatorium, isolation hospital, about 30 miles from Calgarth, by the coast at a place called Grange-over-Sands. It was a long recovery. He and about 6 boys were in there. He had pleurisy, he had TB. From Windermere, he then moved to a hospital in Ashford in Kent, near London. But Michael, really remarkably, many years later, and I met Judy, his daughter, I've known her a while, but at the reunion here in May 2022, and she let it slip that Michael had been part of the team that worked for Westinghouse. Now that's a remarkable, a remarkable story. That he worked on the camera that filmed Neil Armstrong landing on the moon. We're in touch with the NASA Museum. He patented certain special things, and he worked on the photography equipment, the camera equipment for the entire Apollo program. So we sort of know about the boy who landed on the moon. There's another one who Mendel Preter. Mendel's slightly different, but Mendel came here. All the children who were allowed to come to the country, they were supposed to be 100% fit, AA, top fitness, health. Mendel was so ill, he was carried onto the airplane. The medical officer at Prague looked him up and down, knew the rules and regulations, and still stamped him fit to travel. So 2 of the other boys carried Mendel onto the plane. Mendel then came here. He stayed in Ethel Headley Hospital, Children's Hospital here next to Calgarth. He then went to the States, became a very, very successful in financial services. But the interesting thing with Mendel is he made friends with a local boy called Kevin Coulter. Kevin was in the hospital at Ethel Headley Hospital. He had a form of polio, and this is where Mendel was taken. One day, Kevin said, a rabbi came in and said, we've got another Jewish boy we'd like to come into this hospital and put him in a bed next to you. Would you look after him? And Kevin said, well, I can't go anywhere, can I? Stuck in a bed. And he said, the next thing he remembers Mendel coming in, this tiny figure. He said, came in and I put him in a bed next to me. And he said, we became great, great friends. Kevin from Wigan and Mendel from that background. Mendel then left and he moved on. Do you know, to this day, Kevin from Wigan and Mendel, survivor of the Holocaust, they still talk to each other on the telephone every 6 weeks.
That's brilliant.
Kevin in Cumbria, Mendel, I think, living in Florida now. So it's a remarkable story. It's one of the persistent. And Kevin said, yeah, we got on really, really well. He said, I knew nothing about what Mendel had lived through, but I got slowly over time at this little hospital in a little place called Troutbeck Bridge in the Lake District. He told me his story. And Kevin, he's 94, 95 now, and Kevin will start crying now. And Kevin isn't a soft, but he's quite, he's a Cumbrian guy. And he said, and when Mendel told me, I learned myself never to complain about anything else in my life. And the really lovely story, I'll finish this little section on this. Kevin's, because it was an isolation hospital, they weren't allowed visitors very often, the diseases were. So Kevin said, my mother visited from Wigan, came to see me. She was allowed very occasionally. And when she came, she sat in a seat next to our 2 beds. And she held my hand and she held Mendel's hand. And I think that's just a beautiful thought. And Mendel remembers that. So there are two. I mean, obviously there are many, many more, but those are the two that leap into my mind.
No, it's brilliant. So a member of the royal family visited your project not too long ago, last year in September 2021. So how did the Duchess of Cambridge's visit come about, and the importance of her visit to the survivors in the project?
I was approached by the royal household. The Duchess of Cambridge, could I arrange for the Duchess to meet some survivors and some of the second generation, ostensibly a private visit, but I don't think anything she can do can be totally private when it's in the Lake District. And so I arranged for the Duchess to meet Ike and Arek. We went on a boat with them so she could spend time with each of them, learn their stories. And then we came into Windermere and we went into a small room, and everybody wasn't allowed in there apart from second generation and third, so she could ask them. Her interests, she had watched the Windermere Children, and she and her husband, the Duke of Cambridge, they're very interested in the mental well-being of children, of young people. So this fitted into her interests, and she wanted to find out what impact the landscape had on our survivors when they came. Did it help? What care were they offered? She talked to Arek and Ike, and they were charm personified. She was absolutely wonderful, effortlessly put them at their ease. And then she vastly overran her time. She was supposed to be here because she got so interested. They were trying to get me to hurry her on. I said, no, I'm not hurrying on the future queen. She was absolutely wonderful, and she learned a lot. And we've kind of kept in touch. She's very interested in their story in terms of them being survivors, but also how they rebuilt their lives, the care, the therapy. She's pretty terrific on that score. And for us, a visit from the future queen, from the Duchess, had enormous impact on our coverage. I mean, their social media explodes with this thing. She would keep in touch through the royal households on what we're doing. She invited two of the survivors, Ike and Arek, to a special event a few months later, and introduced them to her husband. So it was, but she's a terrific person. But she, the Duchess recognizes the challenges that face some young people today, and she's on a tremendous learning curve. And she's a terrific listener. She listened and asked questions, and you can tell I'm very affectionate about the visit, and the way she was with the survivors, and the way she was with the second generation. No, I think we're very fortunate to have her on the scene with us. And very, very moving. And the day after she'd been, and I walked around Little Windermere Village, I think I was the most popular person in Windermere. I couldn't go anywhere with everybody. I felt like royalty myself. Yeah, her light shone on me. It was she has an enormous impact, and she's a good person. Yeah.
So 5 years from now, Mr. Avery, what are your hopes and goals for your project?
We have an aspiration. I was recently approached by a benefactor and a group of people, and we're in the very early stages of looking to build a centre and a learning centre and a commemorative, won't call it a museum, much more than a museum, on the actual site of Calgarth. Where I'm speaking from now is the library in Windermere, which has been a terrific home for us since 2010. But people come in and say, so where did this happen? And I said, well, it's about 1.5 miles away. And actually the site of Calgarth, where our children stayed, where the local community was, the village it's a wartime village, so it was taken down in the early 60s. But we have a school on the site. So we have a higher school. So what a great place in terms of education potential to build a commemorative centre to host what we have a huge archive. We have a huge wealth of material to share with archivists, and the whole thrust of it though is to commemorate the link between the area and these survivors. But every survivor I've ever spoken to and second gen will say the roots of everything we do is education. It's put towards education. At the moment, we have limited facilities to share our work with educationalists. You know, it's not the place. We become almost like a victim of our own success. We're just not big enough here. And it would be on the actual site. And some of the archaeology from the camps, from the camp where they stayed when they came here, Calgarth camp, some of that will be built into the museum. We're talking to a very, very top level international architect, and the estimated guess is 5 to 7 years. So by 5 years, I may be walking around a building site with a hard hat on, so I'm thinking, oh, nearly there. But that's our hope, that we become sort of a beacon for the world, and we have it from their families. I'll leave with this. Sir Ben Helfgott, when I spoke to him, I said, look, Ben, in 2005, I'd like to do a memorial to you guys in the Lake District. And Ben said, no memorials, Trevor. We didn't die there. We came alive again. So the project we have in mind here will celebrate life. It will acknowledge where they came from, because it'd be ridiculous to celebrate their lives, but not talk about why this was paradise after what they'd been through. But it will be a positive, it will hopefully be a centre for therapists, for caring of children, and use some of the lessons we've learned from the care of these children, from art therapy to English teaching to trauma, all manner of aspects to it. And you have to say, for a while, the therapists here, Oscar Friedman, Marie Paneth, they all came through Anna Freud. That's the connection. And we had the most forward thinking and the best of psychoanalysis from Central Europe. Britain was relatively, my grandfather, for instance, was an orphan in an orphanage here. And he wasn't damaged by it, but it was very much kind of an orderly upbringing. He inevitably went through that and went to the army. That's the program. Whereas these children were allowed to find themselves. It was child-centered learning. And we found really strong evidence here that that's partly why the Windermere is felt so fondly from the survivors. Leonard Montefiore famously said he was accused, and the team here of carers were accused of indulging the children too much, spoiling them. And he said, but people missed the point. We had to gain the trust of us as adults. After what adults had done to them, the first thing we had to do was gain their trust as adults so they could trust us. And then we could set about the task of equipping them to be part of a civilized society again. And that's a really important lesson. And the other important lesson here was their work didn't end in Windermere. Leonard Montefiore and Central British Fund, they were supported, some of them for up to 10 years, some of them 15 years later. And it was a lifetime of support, really. It wasn't sort of Windermere, then they were let loose. It was a really good way to care for damaged, traumatized young people. And we do well. I think people are looking at the example set here and how they're treated to apply it to present day. And I think it is fascinating. They were way ahead of the curve here for treating, it was child-centered learning.
So, Mr. Avery, we like to end by asking our guests for words of wisdom. So, what would be your words of wisdom for our listeners?
I think what I hinted at earlier, don't presume that somebody else has either done the work or will do it. If you feel it in your heart, I mean, I set out on this journey really not expecting what to come next. I thought maybe a 2-year project, if that, but throw yourself into it. Don't listen to people who may say, well, why? What's the point? You know, stick to your guns, and you get there in the end. I know it's a simple question, but the number of times people have shrugged their shoulders at me and said, why do you do this? What's the point? And yes, it's very, very nice to have, you know, Warner Brothers and the BBC make a drama and a documentary based on the archive you got. But the most important thing I can say is you need the archive in the first place. And that you have to listen to people, you have to find people. And every time people say, oh, you've done it now, what next? You just follow. You've got to be quite single-minded and quite dogged and quite determined. And I'd say, just if you feel something is right, go for it. And I mean that in a moral way, ethical way, in all sorts of ways. Because the risk is, somebody approached me in 2018, and they now want to do a lot of work about this, about the surviving children. And what they said to me was, I wish I'd started when you did, because there are hardly any left to talk to. And I think when I began with people here, we kind of made a decision, we need to talk to these people. They weren't young then. Documents, paperwork, they're always there. They'll always emerge from archives. But you need to find the time to find them, because you need to get the witnesses, you need to get their lived experience of it. And you have to just sit down and really determinedly do it. Because once they've gone, they've gone. You don't have a second chance at this. I hope that's
Oh, no, that's brilliant. You've definitely given me some words of wisdom, so I'm sure that's something that everyone will take away. Well, thank you so much for your time, Mr. Avery. It's always a pleasure speaking to you. It's been brilliant, so thank you.
Yeah. And good luck with everything.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So thank you to Hadaya Blau, the program coordinator, Dr. Shai Pilnick, director of the Fish Center, and Lois Roman, producer of the show. Please join us next month to meet another wonderful guest who pulls the past into the present and makes the Holocaust relevant in today's world. Also, many thanks to our community partners.
The Holocaust and Human Rights Education Center in White Plains, the Center for Holocaust Education of East Valley JCC in Arizona, 3GNY, the Florida Holocaust Museum, the Rabbi Arthur Schneier Program for International Affairs at Yeshiva University, Shadowlight, Manhattan College Holocaust Genocide and Interfaith Education Center, the San Antonio Holocaust Museum, SOSUA 75, Johannesburg Holocaust and Genocide Center, 2 programs at the University of Miami, the Illinois Holocaust Museum, the Holocaust Education Center in Fukuyama, Japan, the Sister Rose Thiering Fund for Education in Jewish Christian Studies, Lake District Holocaust Project, Jewish Gen, the Nancy and David Wolf Holocaust and Humanities Center, and the Holocaust Education Resource Center in Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Well, thank you again, Mr. Avery. It's always a pleasure, and I'm sure we'll speak again soon one day.
Yeah, take care now.
Thank you. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.